The HOA meeting notice wasn't even on my mailbox yet when I first saw the drones. Little whirring toys hovering above my tomato patch, buzzing like mechanical hornets over the rows of lettuce and cucumbers I'd planted behind the old cedar fence. I was kneeling in the dirt, checking irrigation lines, when one of them dipped low enough for me to see the HOA logo stickered on its body. That's when I knew trouble was coming, not because of the drone itself, but because anything with that logo meant a complaint was brewing somewhere in the board's group chat. The last time they sent one, it was about my non-compliant barn color. Before that, it was my unauthorized solar panels. Now, apparently, my vegetables were public enemy number one. The message came 2 days later. Notice of violation, agricultural activity not permitted in residential zone. They fined me $500 and gave me 10 days to cease all commercial operations. I almost laughed. Commercial? My farm was 6 raised beds, a coop with 4 hens, and a rain barrel system I'd built from leftover PVC. But laughing wouldn't help. I'd learned that with this HOA, logic was like fertilizer on concrete, it just ran off without sinking in. I bought this 3-acre lot because it sat right at the edge of the subdivision line. My deed even included an extra half-acre buffer that technically wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, though they loved pretending it was. The board president, Cheryl Donahue, 60, sharp bob haircut, perfume that could paralyze a small mammal, was obsessed with property values. She saw my coop as the beginning of rural decay. The irony was that before the subdivision was built, this whole area was farmland. The developers just paved over it, slapped fancy names like Maple Ridge Estates on the signs, and sold nostalgia for a premium. Cheryl's letter was signed with her usual flourish. "We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining our community's standards." I pinned it to my fridge like a trophy, because this time I wasn't going to argue. I was going to make them regret opening the rulebook at all. The first move was information. I spent the next evening rereading my deed, the HOA charter, and every county zoning ordinance I could find. It took 3 hours and 2 mugs of coffee before I spotted it. A clause stating that HOA jurisdiction ended precisely 15 feet past the rear property stake. I'd measured my fence at 25. That meant 10 feet of my so-called violating farmland wasn't legally theirs to regulate. Better yet, the HOA had been using my land for their walking path extension, a gravel strip behind the fence where residents liked to jog. Every footstep on that trail was technically trespassing. That realization hit like caffeine straight to the brain. They fined me for farming, I could fine them for walking. I didn't act immediately. First, I wanted to watch them overplay their hand. So I let the fine deadline pass. On day 11, Cheryl showed up in person, clipboard in hand, marching up my driveway with 2 other board members like they were serving a royal decree. Her Lexus idled at the curb, hazards blinking. I wiped my hands on my jeans and met them halfway. "Mr. Reed," she began, always Mr. Reed when she was about to be condescending, "you've ignored multiple notices regarding your illegal agricultural activity." I nodded. "You mean my garden?" "Your farm," she corrected. "We have photographic evidence." "Oh, the drone?" I said. "Yeah, I saw your little spy toys." Her nostrils flared. "The drones are for community inspection purposes." "Over private property?" She blinked, clearly not expecting that comeback. "You consented to inspections when you joined the association." "Actually," I said, "I didn't join. The HOA was formed after my purchase. I'm subject to shared easements, not membership." That earned me a thin-lipped smile. The kind people give when they realize they're losing control but refuse to admit it. "We'll see what our council says," she snapped, scribbling something on her clipboard before turning away. That was fine by me. I already knew what her counsel would say. Lawyers bill by the hour, and I was about to give them a field day. The following week, I sent my letter, certified mail, signature required. It was short, professional, and very clear. Notice of trespass and unauthorized use of private property. The Maple Ridge HOA and its agents have been using a 0.47-acre portion of my deeded land for an unapproved walking path. Continued access constitutes trespass under County Ordinance 4-19. Effective immediately, I am assessing a usage fee of $200 per incident per day until access ceases or a lease agreement is executed. I attached surveyor maps, timestamps from trail cameras I'd installed overnight, and a neat spreadsheet tallying estimated daily traffic. By my count, they owed me roughly $12,000. I didn't expect them to pay. I expected them to panic, and panic they did. Within 48 hours, the HOA email thread leaked through a friendly neighbor who'd had enough of Cheryl's power trip. Apparently, Cheryl called an emergency meeting, demanding they counterfine me for harassment and frivolous claims. Another member pointed out that if my survey was accurate, the HOA insurance might be liable for back rent. The treasurer nearly fainted. That's when I knew I'd hit a nerve. They sent a lawyered-up letter next, thick envelope, embossed seal, full of legal fluff meant to intimidate. I read every word, then mailed back my own response. 2 pages of calm dissection, citing their own bylaws against them. They'd violated Section 8, subsection B. The association shall not encroach upon or make improvements upon private property without written consent. I had never consented. My tone was polite but surgical. Every sentence was designed to remind them I wasn't bluffing. A week later, the walking path signs disappeared. They still hadn't paid, but the gravel stopped seeing footprints. The silence was victory enough, for now. But HOAs don't surrender, they regroup. I saw Cheryl again at the grocery store, pretending not to see me while loudly telling a friend how some people just don't understand community living. 2 days later, a code enforcement officer showed up at my gate, clipboard identical to hers. He looked embarrassed as he told me someone had reported unpermitted livestock structures. The hens clucked in the background, oblivious. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. "Sure," I said, opening the gate. "Just stay on the gravel. That's still technically HOA land." He froze mid-step. "Wait, seriously?" "Yep. Funny story." I handed him a copy of the deed map. 10 minutes later, he was laughing harder than I'd seen anyone laugh in months. "You know," he said, "they're in more trouble than you are." I shrugged. "I just grow tomatoes." That evening, I got an email from Cheryl herself. "You are making this unnecessarily difficult. Please remove all farming equipment and livestock immediately, or further fines will be issued." I replied with one line: "Further trespass will incur additional charges." Invoice attached. The invoice listed $14,200. The next morning, a notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board. Residents are reminded to avoid the rear walking trail pending survey clarification. Translation: they knew they'd lost the legal ground but couldn't admit it publicly. Still, something told me this wasn't over. Cheryl wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. And sure enough, 2 nights later, motion sensors picked up headlights creeping near the fence. I peeked out and saw her Lexus again, parked near the path. 2 silhouettes, Cheryl and her vice president, were pacing with flashlights, measuring tape in hand. I watched them cross the boundary line twice, back and forth, arguing quietly. That was all the evidence I needed. My trail cameras caught every frame. By morning, I had printed stills, timestamps, and the legal code highlighted in yellow. If they wanted to play the fine game, I was ready to take it to round 2. Because now I had proof that the enforcers themselves had become the violators, and the next fine wouldn't be symbolic. It would be binding. By sunrise, I'd printed 2 copies of everything: photos, timestamps, parcel maps, the trespass statute highlighted in neon yellow. I slid one packet into a manila envelope labeled Maple Ridge HOA, legal notice, and hand-delivered it to their drop box on my way to work. The other copy went into my safe at home. Experience had taught me that HOA paperwork had a mysterious way of disappearing when it didn't fit their narrative. This time, I wasn't leaving anything to chance. For the next few days, the neighborhood felt unnaturally quiet. The walking trail behind my property stayed empty, and even Cheryl's Lexus wasn't parked in its usual corner spot near the clubhouse. The stillness was almost unsettling. But peace in Maple Ridge was like the eye of a hurricane. It never lasted. On Friday evening, I came home to find 2 envelopes taped to my front door. The first, thin and crisp, was from the HOA again. Notice of escalated fines, continued agricultural violations and harassment of board members. The amount had jumped to $2,000. The second envelope, heavier and sealed with a gold emblem, was from the county sheriff's office. My stomach dropped for half a second before I read the header. Notice of complaint, trespass and harassment allegation. Cheryl had filed a police complaint against me. I almost laughed out loud. The woman who had been filmed trespassing on my land was accusing me of harassment. I called the sheriff's office the next morning. The deputy on the phone recognized my name before I even finished. "Ah, the Maple Ridge situation," he said, amused. "Yeah, we got a report from a Mrs. Donahue claiming you're surveilling HOA members." "I have cameras on my own property," I replied. "Which, incidentally, they entered without permission." He chuckled. "We figured as much. Just needed to log your side for the record. Between you and me, she's been calling every department in the county trying to make it someone else's problem." "Appreciate the heads up," I said. "Would you like copies of the footage?" "Already saw them," he said. Code enforcement forwarded the files after laughing for about 10 minutes straight. That conversation made my weekend. But by Monday, Cheryl escalated again. She wasn't going through the county anymore, she'd gone federal. A certified letter arrived from her lawyer, claiming unlawful surveillance, emotional distress, and interference with community governance. The phrasing was so overblown it read like a parody. Still, I wasn't careless enough to ignore it. I scheduled an appointment with my own attorney, a sharp-tongued woman named Vivian Blackwater, who had once sued a developer into bankruptcy for misrepresenting flood zones. Vivian read the letter twice, leaned back in her chair, and smirked. "They really don't know who they're picking a fight with." "I'm just growing vegetables," I said. "You're also sitting on prime leverage. They built that trail illegally, correct?" "Correct. I've got everything documented." She tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Then we counterclaim. You file a cease and desist for defamation and unauthorized surveillance claims, and we attach your trespass evidence as Exhibit A." "That'll cost them more than a few tomatoes," I said dryly. She grinned. "I like your style." By Thursday, Vivian had sent her response letter. Calm, devastating, and perfectly professional. It stated that my security cameras were within my rights, that Cheryl's actions constituted both trespass and attempted intimidation, and that any further HOA fines would be treated as retaliation. She even copied the county zoning board and the HOA's insurance provider for good measure. Nothing terrifies a volunteer board like the words insurance liability. The silence that followed was delicious. For 2 weeks, not a single drone appeared over my fence. The HOA newsletter skipped its usual compliance corner section. Even Cheryl's usual weekend wine gatherings vanished. But I wasn't naive. Cheryl's pride was too inflated to let things die quietly. When people like her couldn't win on paper, they tried to win with gossip. I started hearing whispers at the local hardware store. Neighbors saying things like, "He's suing the HOA for money," or "He's turning his house into a commercial farm." Classic Cheryl tactics: spread fear until people take her side by default. But what she didn't know was that my next move was already in motion. That unused half-acre buffer between my lot and the trail had always been technically agricultural land, zoned for light use. I'd filed paperwork to make it official. A small permit for educational agricultural demonstration purposes. Essentially, a legal mini-farm for community education. The county approved it in less than a week. The kicker? Because the HOA had argued I was running a commercial operation, the permit now confirmed that I was allowed to grow and sell produce on that portion of my land. Legally. Publicly. With signage. The first morning I put up the new sign, Reed Educational Farm, organic produce and honey for sale, felt like Christmas. I even installed a little roadside stand with baskets of tomatoes, eggs, and jars of honey from my friend's apiary. Within hours, half the neighborhood stopped by to buy something, more out of curiosity than need. Even the local paper's community section sent a photographer. Cheryl's reaction was immediate and volcanic. She stormed up to my stand that afternoon, hands balled into fists, sunglasses perched like a battle helmet. "You can't sell things here," she shouted before I even said hello. "Sure I can," I said mildly, handing a customer their change. "Got a county permit right there." I pointed to the laminated copy taped to the side of the stand. She squinted, reading, her face draining of color. "This is ridiculous. You can't run a business in a residential area." "Correction," I said. "Educational agricultural demonstration. Feel free to take it up with zoning." Again. She sputtered, gesturing toward the houses behind her. "You're ruining property values." "The tomatoes?" I asked. "Or the honey?" Her voice cracked. "The entire aesthetic of the neighborhood." "Ah," I said. "You mean the aesthetic of paved-over farmland pretending to be rustic? I'm just restoring the authenticity." That line made two nearby customers snort with laughter. Cheryl's face turned beet red. She spun around and marched back to her Lexus, tires crunching gravel as she sped off. The next morning, she sent out an emergency HOA bulletin warning residents not to engage with or financially support unlicensed vendors. Except my permit was very much licensed. In fact, I forwarded her email to the county inspector, who replied publicly to all recipients clarifying that the Reed Educational Farm was in full compliance and an asset to the local community. It was a knockout punch in broad daylight. But Cheryl still had one weapon left, her network. She started recruiting sympathetic board members to vote on a new amendment, one that would expand HOA jurisdiction for community safety and uniformity. If it passed, they could technically reassert control over the buffer zone. The vote required a 2/3 majority. I only needed 1/3 plus 1 to block it. So I got to work. I knocked on doors, handed out baskets of tomatoes and eggs, and told my side of the story. Not in anger, not in arrogance, just calmly with the receipts. I showed them the drone footage, the trespass maps, the emails, the county letter. By the end of that weekend, at least 10 families had promised to vote against the amendment. More importantly, they were furious that their HOA fees were being used to fund Cheryl's personal vendetta. When voting day came, the clubhouse was packed. Cheryl stood at the front like a general before battle, armed with a projector showing photos of my coop and garden. "This," she said, "is how neighborhoods fall into decline. If we don't act, Maple Ridge will look like a barnyard." Then it was my turn. I walked up, calm, holding a single envelope. "Before you vote," I said, "I'd like to show you something." I pulled out printed photos. Cheryl and her vice president, trespassing on my land with flashlights and measuring tape. Gasps rippled through the room. "If this amendment passes," I continued, "these same people will have the right to walk into your yards. You comfortable with that?" The silence that followed was perfect. Cheryl tried to stammer something about context, but the damage was done. When the votes were counted, the amendment failed, 21 against, 7 in favor. Cheryl's face went pale as marble. As I walked out, Vivian texted me, "Congrats. You just turned a fine into freedom." But I wasn't celebrating yet. Because something in Cheryl's expression told me this wasn't her final defeat. The kind of people who crave control don't stop when they lose. They just change tactics. And sure enough, a few nights later, I saw her Lexus idling near the curb again. Headlights off. Waiting. Whatever she was planning next, it wasn't just about vegetables anymore. When I saw Cheryl's Lexus parked at the edge of the cul-de-sac that night, headlights off, I knew she wasn't there for the view. I could almost picture her gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on my porch light through the windshield, trying to figure out her next move. People like Cheryl never acted without an audience, so the fact she was skulking around in the dark meant desperation had replaced strategy. I switched off my own porch light and watched from the upstairs window, unseen. After 10 minutes, another car pulled up, a gray sedan. Out stepped 2 men in reflective vests carrying clipboards. She was staging something official again. The trio paced along the fence line, flashlights slicing through the darkness. One of the men bent down, pointing at my irrigation pipes, while Cheryl gestured wildly, as if narrating a documentary about illegal rural activity. I turned on my camera feed. The trail cameras caught every second. Eventually, they left, and I noticed Cheryl taking photos of my Reed Educational Farm sign before driving off. That was fine. I had a feeling her next move would involve more paper than presents. Sure enough, 3 mornings later, I received a notice from the County Environmental Quality Department. Apparently, someone had reported agricultural waste runoff contaminating storm drains. The irony was delicious. I didn't even have storm drains near my property, just gravel trenches that absorbed everything naturally. Still, the county had to investigate. The inspector, a tall, easygoing guy named Tyler, arrived the next afternoon. He walked the property, took one look at the compost pile, and burst out laughing. "She really hates you, huh?" he said. "You have no idea." He checked the soil runoff points, glanced at my drainage permits, and shrugged. "Everything's perfect. Actually, cleaner than half the community lawns I've inspected." "Can I get that in writing?" He grinned. "Already printing it." By the time the official report came through, clearing me of all violations, Cheryl's campaign had begun to unravel. The county's public notice system posted the inspection results online, which meant everyone could see the complaint was bogus. Word spread fast, especially after the local newspaper followed up on the earlier neighborhood farm story with a headline that read, "Homeowner harassed by HOA after legal permit approved." They even published a photo of me handing out tomatoes to neighborhood kid. Cheryl must have choked on her morning latte. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. That week, a new HOA rule appeared on the bulletin board. No resident shall operate machinery or maintain livestock between the hours of 6 p.m. and 9 a.m. I checked the fine print. Technically, it included tractors, generators, or equipment associated with agricultural use. In other words, they were trying to ban my irrigation timer and coop lights. I sent a message to the entire HOA mailing list. For clarity, the HOA has no jurisdiction over non-member properties. Enforcement of these rules on deeded agricultural land will constitute further trespass. Within an hour, my email thread exploded. Half the neighborhood started arguing, some siding with Cheryl about community standards, others defending me for exposing her nonsense. It became the most entertaining civil war Maple Ridge had ever seen. One neighbor, Frank from Lot 23, stopped by that evening. A retired engineer with a soft spot for troublemakers, he handed me a flash drive. "You didn't get this from me," he said. "But Cheryl's been using HOA funds for her lawyer fees. My wife's on the finance subcommittee." I opened the files after he left. They contained scanned receipts, legal invoices addressed to Maple Ridge HOA, not Cheryl personally. That meant she'd been using everyone's dues to fight her own private vendetta. And that wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. I forwarded the evidence to Vivian, my attorney. Her reply came within minutes. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Vivian drafted a formal complaint to the HOA's insurer and CC'd every board member. The email's subject line was simple: potential misappropriation of funds. The fallout was immediate. The treasurer resigned the next day, claiming personal reasons. The vice president stopped showing up to meetings. Cheryl, however, stayed, because people like her would rather sink the ship than admit they're not the captain. Within 48 hours, a group of homeowners called for a special meeting to vote on a temporary suspension of the board pending audit result. Cheryl called it an illegal mutiny. I called it karma with a clipboard. The meeting took place in the clubhouse on a stormy Thursday evening. The tension in the air could have powered my irrigation pump. Cheryl stood at the front again, flanked by her dwindling supporters. Her voice shook as she opened with, "This community has thrived under structure and order. We cannot allow one resident to undermine that." When it was my turn, I didn't bother with speeches. I just held up a photo, her Lexus parked behind my fence line at night. "Structure and order?" I said. "This is your president, trespassing to find dirt on her own neighbor." Literally. A murmur swept through the crowd. Someone from the back shouted, "She used our money for her lawyer." Another followed, "She's the one hurting property values." The vote wasn't even close. Cheryl was suspended indefinitely, pending audit. She stormed out before the tally was finished, her heels clicking like gunshots across the tile. I thought that was the endgame, but Cheryl had one last trick hidden up her manicured sleeve. A few days later, I came home to find orange survey flags dotting the edge of my property again. New ones. Fresh stakes. The kind used for utility easement marking. My gut told me it wasn't coincidence. I called the county office, and sure enough, Cheryl had filed a community easement expansion request, claiming the HOA needed to reclaim shared land boundaries for public safety. The kicker? She listed my fence line as part of the new boundary proposal. If approved, it would grant the HOA permanent access through my buffer zone again. It was bold, desperate, and brilliant in the worst way. Vivian and I met the county surveyor the next morning. He confirmed it. The request was real. "But she can't do that," he said. "The HOA doesn't own that land." "She's betting on paperwork confusion," Vivian muttered. "If it passes initial review, it'll take weeks to reverse." "Then we stop it before it gets there," I said. Vivian smiled, that dangerous smile lawyers get when they smell blood. "How do you feel about a public hearing?" The hearing was set for the following Wednesday. Cheryl must have thought she could bury me in bureaucracy, but hearings meant records, and records meant evidence. I arrived with a binder thicker than a Bible. Maps, photos, letters, invoices, and a notarized statement from Tyler, the environmental inspector, confirming the HOA's history of false complaints. Cheryl arrived late, flanked by two men in suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. When it was her turn to speak, she painted herself as a martyr. "This homeowner has been hostile, uncooperative, and disruptive to the peaceful enjoyment of our neighborhood," she said dramatically. "We're simply trying to restore order." Then Vivian stood up. Calm, composed, deadly. "Order is admirable," she said, "but fraud is not." She flipped open the binder, revealing Cheryl's signatures on the trespass photos, the misuse of funds, the false environmental complaint. "This board president has repeatedly violated county law and her own charter to target a private citizen. The HOA's request is not about safety, it's about revenge." The room went silent. The hearing officer stared at Cheryl. "Is this true?" he asked. Cheryl stammered something about miscommunication, but her own attorneys were already packing up. The officer looked unimpressed. "Request denied," he said simply. "And I strongly recommend the HOA seek new leadership." It was over in less than an hour. Outside the hearing room, Vivian clapped me on the shoulder. "You just buried an HOA with paperwork," she said. "That's poetic." I smiled. "No, that's fertilizer." By that evening, the story had spread across the entire subdivision. Cheryl's resignation came through the next morning, citing health reasons. The HOA announced an interim committee to rebuild community trust. I was invited to join it, but I declined. I didn't need power, I just wanted peace, and my tomatoes. For a while, it looked like I'd finally won. The fines were voided, the trespass claims withdrawn, and the walking path quietly removed from all HOA map. But victory, I've learned, doesn't always come clean. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Enjoy your farm while it lasts. The county might not like what I found next. No signature, but I recognized the looping handwriting. Cheryl wasn't done. She'd simply changed battlefields. The unsigned letter sat on my kitchen table for hours before I touched it again. Enjoy your farm while it lasts wasn't a threat in the cinematic sense. It was worse. It sounded like paperwork, bureaucratic sabotage, the kind that doesn't kick down your door but quietly pulls the rug out from under your property lines. I'd seen Cheryl's type before. When cornered, she didn't fight, she filed. And given how quiet she'd been since resigning, that silence felt like the inhale before another swing. I scanned the letter under a bright desk lamp. The paper was high quality, thick, and watermarked, standard for official stationery. Except there was no seal, no department header. Just that single taunting line, typed neatly in Times New Roman. Whoever sent it wanted me to know something was coming but not from where. I checked the envelope's postmark. It came from within the same county. That narrowed it to either Cheryl herself or someone she'd roped into her last act of revenge. I decided not to guess. I decided to wait. 3 days later, the first hint arrived. Not in my mailbox this time, but on my land. 2 county trucks pulled up mid-morning, orange lights flashing. A crew of 3 stepped out with surveying equipment. One of them, a young woman in a neon vest, waved as I approached. "Morning, sir. We're just here to verify new boundary adjustments for the Ridgeview Drainage Initiative." I raised an eyebrow. "Never heard of it." She checked her clipboard. "It's part of a floodplain reassessment. According to the county records, this parcel was reclassified as part of a storm runoff zone last month." My pulse spiked. Reclassified? By who? She flipped through her forms. Maple Ridge HOA petitioned it. Looks like they claimed this section contributes to neighborhood runoff issues. There it was, Cheryl's ghost, haunting the paperwork. I took a deep breath. You might want to double-check the survey map. My property sits on higher elevation than the subdivision. Any runoff flows toward them, not from me. She frowned, peering at her tablet. You're right. That's weird. She turned to her coworkers. Hey Jim, this data's backward. The slope readings are flipped. Jim cursed under his breath. Figures. This is the 3rd time this month we've gotten bad data from HOA submissions. By the time they packed up, the crew leader promised to flag the report for review. Don't worry, sir. Nothing's official until the county confirms topography. If someone's falsifying data, we'll catch it. But I didn't feel relieved. Falsified or not, Cheryl had managed to push a new front through the bureaucratic gate. And she didn't even need to be on the board anymore to do it, she'd just weaponized someone still inside. That night, I walked the fence line with a flashlight, checking the corners where my property met the old walking trail. In the beam's glow, I caught something half buried near the northern stake, a small plastic cylinder with a blinking red light. A motion sensor. I pried it loose and realized it wasn't one of mine. Someone had planted it to track movement along my border. The manufacturer's label read Centrigeo Systems, a brand used by survey contractors and, ironically, by HOA compliance vendors. I pocketed it and went back inside. Vivian answered my call on the second ring. "Let me guess," she said. "Cheryl's still haunting you." "She's trying to get my land reclassified," I said. "And she's got someone feeding her data." Vivian exhaled slowly. "Then it's time we stop reacting and start investigating." We filed a Freedom of Information request the next morning for all county submissions under Maple Ridge HOA's name. When the documents came through 2 days later, the pattern was obvious. Multiple forms filed in rapid succession, each stamped with a different board member's signature, but all uploaded from the same IP address. Cheryl's old email still had administrative access. She'd been forging internal approvals post-resignation. Vivian's grin was predatory. "You know what this is? Fraud. An impersonation of a public entity," she added. "Because those drainage petitions were filed as community hazard claims. That's criminal." I almost felt sorry for Cheryl at that point. Almost. Because as Vivian drafted the formal complaint to the county prosecutor, part of me still wondered what drove someone to burn this much time and reputation over a vegetable garden. Power, yes. Pride, obviously. But beneath that, maybe fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant in the very world she built. The county froze all pending petitions within 24 hours. Cheryl must have realized the walls were closing in because the next week, her Lexus reappeared, this time in broad daylight. She parked right in front of my driveway and stepped out, sunglasses on, arms crossed like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama. "I hope you're happy," she said, voice trembling with restrained fury. "You've destroyed a community." "I grew tomatoes," I said. "You humiliated me," she snapped. "In front of my friends, my neighbors, the entire county. You did that yourself." Her jaw clenched. "You think you've won, but you haven't. The HOA will dissolve, and property values will tank. No one will thank you when their homes lose value because of your ego." I stared at her for a long moment before replying. "You built a cage and called it community. I just left the gate open." For a moment, her expression faltered. Then she turned sharply, got back into her Lexus, and sped off. I thought that might be her last appearance. I was wrong. 2 nights later, the fence cameras caught movement again. This time, more deliberate. I watched the live feed on my phone. 2 figures, hoods up, moving along the border, carrying what looked like bags of fertilizer. Except the bags weren't for planting. They were slashing them open and scattering the contents in my irrigation ditch. When the camera's infrared zoomed in, I realized it wasn't fertilizer. It was salt. They were salting the soil. By the time I reached the edge of the property, they were gone. But I caught one clear frame of a license plate as they fled, the same gray sedan I'd seen during the earlier inspection. The next morning, I filed a vandalism report and sent the footage to Vivian. Within hours, the sheriff's office called back. Deputy Tyler, same one from the environmental check, sounded both angry and entertained. "Salted soil, huh? That's old-school evil. Any chance you can trace the car?" "Already did. Registered to a property management company. Guess who their biggest client is?" "Maple Ridge HOA," I said. "Bingo. We're pulling security footage from their office lot." By evening, Tyler had the confirmation. Cheryl's name wasn't on the rental papers, but one of her old board allies had signed them, Vice President Dale Conroy. When officers confronted him, he cracked almost immediately, claiming Cheryl told him it was weed killer to prevent invasive plants. The sheriff wasn't buying it. Both were fined and charged with property damage. I wish I could say that was the end, but Cheryl's kind of obsession doesn't fade with legal consequences. It ferments. Over the next week, anonymous complaints flooded the county hotline again. Noise violations, illegal signage, unregistered livestock. Each one dismissed, each one clearly from the same source. It would have been funny if it weren't so exhausting. Then came the final twist, the one even Vivian didn't see coming. During the audit of HOA finances triggered by our earlier complaint, investigators uncovered a hidden account. Cheryl had siphoned thousands of dollars from community dues into what she labeled beautification projects. The money? Used to fund her private legal battles. Once that came out, the county froze the HOA's assets entirely. No maintenance, no landscaping, no trash collection. The manicured perfection Cheryl worshipped began to decay within weeks. Grass grew tall, paint peeled, fences sagged. Maple Ridge started looking less like a gated paradise and more like the farmland it replaced. Neighbors who once whispered behind my back now stopped by to ask for advice on composting or irrigation. Some even brought seedlings to plant in the communal green space, jokingly calling it Cheryl's garden. Irony thrives best in fertile soil. Still, I couldn't shake one thought. Cheryl had vanished completely. Her Lexus was gone, her house sold, and no one knew where she'd moved. Part of me hoped she'd finally found peace, until one last envelope arrived 2 months later. No return address again. Inside was a single photograph, an aerial drone shot of my property, dated that week. On the back, a handwritten note, "Still watching." I stared at it for a long while, then walked outside into the glow of the setting sun. The tomatoes were ripening again. The hens clucked lazily, unaware of the ghosts that hovered above their coop. I raised the photo toward the light, then tore it clean in half and tossed it into the compost bin. Let her watch. All she'd see now was growth. Because in the end, the best revenge against control is living freely within your own boundaries, and making sure no one ever redraws them again. When I tore up Cheryl's drone photo and buried it in the compost bin, I thought I was burying the last ghost of her obsession. For a few weeks it even felt true. The tomatoes kept thriving, neighbors kept stopping by for eggs and honey, and the HOA remained a hollow shell of its former self, technically existing but practically dead. Most of the former members had resigned, and the county-appointed auditor was still sifting through the ruins of their finances. Maple Ridge had gone quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you check over your shoulder when you water the plant. Then one morning, I woke up to the sound of hammering. Not my coop, not my irrigation pump. Something metallic, sharp, rhythmic, coming from the far side of the property near the old HOA boundary. I grabbed my jacket and went out back. What I saw made me stop dead in the mud. A construction crew. 5 men, fluorescent vests, a backhoe, and a stack of steel pipes taller than me. They were driving posts into the ground on my land. A brand-new sign leaned against a truck door, still wrapped in plastic. Future site of County Greenbelt Expansion, Ridgeview Environmental Corridor. For a moment I thought it was a joke. Then I noticed the paperwork taped to one of the posts. County permits, freshly stamped. Except the parcel number didn't match mine. It was off by 1 digit. Someone had deliberately misfiled the coordinates, and I didn't have to guess who had the motivation, or the nerve, to pull it off. I called the foreman over. "Morning. You're trespassing." He frowned, checking his clipboard. "No, sir, this is county land. We've got orders from Environmental Development to start laying drainage posts." "Drainage for what?" "For runoff mitigation from Maple Ridge Estates. HOA petitioned it last quarter." I almost laughed. Cheryl had gone full ghost in the machine, still manipulating county systems long after being booted. I showed him my deed map, complete with survey coordinate. The man's face drained of color. "Oh hell. This ain't right," he muttered. "Someone swapped a digit in the file. We're 50 yards off." 50 yards into private property," I said. "You'll need to stop immediately." He nodded, signaling the crew to shut down. "Sorry, sir. We'll pull out till we get this sorted." But I knew how bureaucracy worked. By the time they sorted anything, damage would already be done. I photographed everything. Trucks, equipment, the permit tags, even the tire tracks cutting through my field. Then I called Vivian. She didn't even let me finish. "Cheryl's fingerprints," she said. "Guaranteed. Give me 20 minutes. 2 hours later, she emailed a cease and desist letter so ironclad it could have stopped a freight train. She sent copies to the county engineer, the environmental director, and the contractor's legal department. Within the day, the project was frozen pending investigation. The foreman called me personally to apologize, swearing his crew had no idea. That should have been a victory. But victory didn't feel right when I realized Cheryl wasn't attacking through people anymore, she was attacking through systems. She'd found a way to haunt me without ever showing up. And worse, she was getting creative. The next week, a county letter arrived. This time addressed to property owner, Parcel 18B, Ridgeview Sector. It was a tax reassessment notice. My agricultural exemption had been revoked pending review. That meant my property taxes would triple overnight. I went straight to the assessor's office with every permit, receipt, and zoning approval I'd ever earned. The clerk, an older woman with reading glasses, scanned the file and frowned. "That's strange," she said. "Your exemption was marked as manually revoked by a field officer. But we haven't sent anyone out here in months." She looked up. "Mr. Reed, did you have anyone visit recently claiming to be from our office?" I exhaled sharply. "Not since the bogus drainage crew." She sighed. "Then someone forged internal credentials. It happens occasionally when forms get reused. Don't worry, we'll reinstate it." It took 4 hours of paperwork, but by the time I left, the exemption was back in place. Still, the fact that someone, Cheryl or one of her remaining allies, was forging government access forms wasn't just petty. It was criminal. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the rows of vegetables with a flashlight, half expecting to find another hidden camera or sensor buried under the mulch. The sky was cloudless, stars faint, and the field smelled faintly of wet soil and diesel. For the first time since the war began, I felt tired. Not angry, not vindictive, just tired. Because no matter how many times I won, she found another angle. And I knew the type. She'd keep fighting until someone else took her out completely. Vivian must have sensed the fatigue when I called the next morning. "You're worn down," she said. "Let me take the next hit. You stay quiet. If she wants to weaponize the county, we'll weaponize federal jurisdiction." She wasn't kidding. Within the week, Vivian had filed a report with the State Office of Real Property Integrity, citing forged documents and unauthorized digital submissions. The state launched an audit. And that's when the dominoes started falling. Investigators traced the falsified petitions back to a single user account, one registered to Cheryl's former email, still active under the Maple Ridge HOA domain. It had been used from an IP address linked to a co-working space 20 miles away. Security footage confirmed what we all expected. Cheryl herself, sneaking in at night to use the public terminals. The county suspended all projects tied to her submissions and opened a criminal inquiry. But Cheryl didn't go quietly. The day after the announcement, local news crews showed up at my gate. Apparently, she'd contacted them first, painting herself as a whistleblower who uncovered corruption in local land zoning and was being targeted by a vindictive homeowner with deep pockets. The irony almost made me choke. I didn't talk to reporters, but Vivian did. Calmly, factually, with receipt. She showed them the filed evidence of falsification, the surveillance footage, and the county's official suspension order. The story aired that night under the headline, "Former HOA President Under Investigation for Fraud and Harassment." Cheryl's crusade had officially gone public. The fallout was spectacular. Every homeowner who'd once worshipped her image now wanted distance. People started digging into old HOA budgets, finding years of miscellaneous fees that no one could account for. The county froze her assets. Her Lexus was repossessed. Her house, already listed for sale, was suddenly under lien. Still, none of it made me happy. Because underneath the schadenfreude, I saw a pattern. Cheryl wasn't fighting for power anymore. She was fighting to exist. To her, losing control over Maple Ridge meant vanishing entirely. That kind of person doesn't stop when cornered, they self-destruct. I was proven right a week later when I received a voicemail from an unknown number. Cheryl's voice, fragile, tired, almost unrecognizable. "You win, Marcus. I can't fight anymore. They're taking everything. I just wanted it to be perfect here. I thought if I kept control, people would stay happy. I didn't mean for it to go this far." There was a pause, a shaky inhale. "Take care of the place. Don't let them ruin it." I replayed that message 3 times before forwarding it to Vivian. She said nothing for a long while. Finally, she whispered, "She sounds broken." "Maybe she always was," I said. "We just didn't notice because she wrapped it in rules." The county case moved forward without her. Cheryl vanished again, this time for good. No address, no phone, no new filings. The world moved on quietly. Maple Ridge slowly returned to being just another sleepy neighborhood with imperfect lawns and fewer rules. The Reed Educational Farm became a permanent fixture, complete with a community composting program and open garden days for kids. The HOA officially dissolved 6 months later, replaced by a simple neighborhood association with voluntary dues. The first motion they passed? A plaque installed at the old clubhouse that read, "Freedom grows where control fails." I didn't suggest it, but I didn't argue either. Still, some nights, when the sprinklers hum and the moonlight hits the fence just right, I imagine I can hear her Lexus idling out there, ghostly in the dark, watching. Not with malice anymore, just with longing for a world she built and lost. Maybe that's her real punishment. Maybe that's peace. But one final twist remained. The state sent me a letter 3 months later thanking me for my cooperation. Attached was a check. Reimbursement from recovered HOA funds illegally collected. It wasn't huge, but enough to feel symbolic. At the bottom, a note from the investigator read, "You helped set a precedent. Future HOAs will think twice before crossing property lines." I folded the letter, looked out across my land, and smiled. The soil had recovered where the salt had been dumped. The plants thrived again. Freedom had roots now, deep, stubborn, and permanent. For the first time since the war began, I realized something. I hadn't just defended my land. I'd reclaimed my peace. Cheryl had spent years trying to control a neighborhood that never really belonged to her. I just reminded everyone what it meant to belong to yourself. And as the sunset hit the coop, painting everything in gold, I realized her final words weren't wrong. I would take care of the place, just not the way she wanted. Spring came early the following year, bringing with it a kind of peace that didn't feel borrowed. The air was warmer, the soil richer, the hens louder. The war with Cheryl had faded into local folklore, told with laughter at backyard barbecues. "Remember when the HOA tried to fine Marcus for farming?" people would say, shaking their heads like it was an urban legend. I never corrected them. My farm had grown. 2 more raised beds, a new irrigation line, a small greenhouse made from reclaimed glass. The Reed Educational Farm had become a local Saturday attraction, complete with kids picking strawberries and parents asking about compost ratios. It was calm, predictable, almost too much so. One Sunday morning, while I was loading crates of tomatoes for the farmer's market, a black SUV rolled up my driveway. No logos, tinted windows. The driver stepped out, short, wiry man in a navy suit, government badge clipped to his pocket. "Mr. Reed?" he asked. "Marcus Reed." "That depends who's asking," I said cautiously. "Special Investigator Hartman, State Office of Real Property Integrity." "May I have a word?" The title made my stomach tighten. "You're from the office that handled the HOA audit." He nodded. "We're finalizing the report. There's just one loose thread." He followed me to the porch. His tone was polite, but he spoke like someone used to peeling back secrets. "We've completed our investigation into Maple Ridge HOA," he said. "Your cooperation helped uncover a network of fraudulent filings across multiple subdivisions, some connected to your former HOA president, Mrs. Donahue." I folded my arms. I figured she'd been doing that long before I planted my first tomato. "She had help," he said. "We traced the paper trail to a developer group. The same one that built Maple Ridge 20 years ago. Cheryl was acting as an unofficial liaison, keeping property values inflated for future resale. The group went under 5 years ago, but someone's been using their credentials to continue filing maintenance requests, tax reevaluations, even drainage permits. That explained the forged construction orders and fake exemption revocations. "And you think Cheryl's still behind it?" He hesitated. "We're not sure. She disappeared completely. No forwarding address, no financial activity, nothing. But someone used her ID card 3 weeks ago to access county files. Security footage shows a woman, same build, wearing a scarf and sunglasses. I felt a cold flicker crawl up my spine. What does this have to do with me? Hartman reached into his briefcase and pulled out a printed map. This, he said, pointing to a red line that cut through my acreage, is a proposed boundary adjustment filed just last week. Under your name. I stared at it. That's not mine. I didn't think so, he said. It reallocates part of your land to the Ridgeview Public Corridor, same trick she tried before. But this time, it's filed under your digital signature. How? Forgery again. They cloned your notarized application from last year's farm permit. Someone still has your data. I felt the world tilt slightly. After everything, lawsuits, fines, public hearings, Cheryl or whoever inherited her grudge was still out there, still trying to rewrite the map beneath my boot. Hartman slid a folder across the table. We'll handle it from here, Mr. Reed. But keep an eye out. Whoever's doing this is meticulous. She or they don't make random moves. After he left, I sat on the porch for a long time, watching the hens scratch in the dust. It wasn't fear that filled me, but something heavier, resignation. Cheryl might be gone, but her obsession had taken root in the system itself. She'd become an idea. That control could be coded into land records, that power could outlive the person wielding it. I didn't sleep much that night. Around 2 a.m., I got up, poured a cup of coffee, and pulled up my security feed. The fence, the coop, the gate, all quiet. Then, on camera 6, a flicker of movement. A shadow near the old walking path. A person in a hood, crouched near one of the boundary posts, shining a small light. I zoomed in. The image pixelated, but I could see hands working quickly, unscrewing the stake marker and replacing it with a new one. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out the back door. By the time I reached the fence, the figure was halfway across the field. "Hey!" I shouted. They froze, then bolted. I sprinted after them, catching the beam of the flashlight across their back. They were small, fast, maybe late 40s. The hood fell for a split second, revealing streaks of silver-blonde hair. "Cheryl! Stop!" I yelled. But she didn't. She vanished into the tree line, swallowed by the dark. When I reached the post, I saw what she'd left behind. A new metal stake with a laminated tag. Proposed boundary adjustment, pending review. The same red stamp Hartman had shown me earlier. And tied to it, a ribbon, yellow, frayed, faded by weather. The kind the HOA once used during inspections. It was almost poetic. Her final ghost mark. The next morning, I handed the stake and ribbon to Hartman's team. They confirmed the fingerprint match within days. Cheryl had indeed been forging applications across multiple counties, all under old HOA credentials. They issued a warrant, but she was already gone. Again. The news made waves. Local stations dubbed her the Phantom President, spinning the story into something half thriller, half comedy. But for me, it wasn't entertainment. It was unfinished business. Because every map, every document, every boundary line she'd touched still had to be corrected. And that meant months of hearings, revisions, inspections. The kind of administrative ghosts that never truly die. Still, something unexpected came out of it. The county offered me a role on the new Landowner Advisory Council, a small committee created to prevent future abuse of property filings. I said yes, not out of revenge, but out of responsibility. If I'd learned anything, it was that control thrives in silence. The only real defense was transparency. The first meeting felt strange. Sitting in an air-conditioned office, wearing a collared shirt instead of work gloves, I almost laughed at the absurdity. Me, the guy who once filled fence holes with glitter and foam to spite an HOA, now advising county officials on land ethics. But irony, like compost, has a way of nourishing new growth. Months passed. Cheryl was never caught. Rumors floated. Someone had seen her in Colorado, another in Oregon. Maybe both. Maybe neither. I stopped checking. I had my own work to do. My little farm grew into something larger. A proper community garden, co-managed by neighbors. Kids learned how to plant beans. Adults learned how to mind their own business. For the first time in years, Maple Ridge felt like what it was supposed to be, a neighborhood, not a battleground. Then, one late afternoon, while I was fixing the rain barrels, a car pulled up. Not a Lexus. A weathered hatchback. A woman stepped out, older, thinner, wearing jeans and a plain gray hoodie. Her hair, silver now, was pulled back tightly. It took me a moment to recognize her. "Cheryl," I said quietly. She didn't look defiant anymore. Just tired. "I came to say sorry," she said. "And to return something." She handed me an envelope. Inside was a folded deed, the original map of Maple Ridge before the subdivision existed. "I kept it," she said. "All these years. I thought if I could keep things perfect, I could stop everything from falling apart. My husband left, my friends moved away. The HOA was the last thing I had control over." Her voice cracked. "You took that away. But you were right to." For a long time, I said nothing. Then I handed the deed back. "You should give it to the county. Let it belong to everyone again." She nodded slowly. "Maybe I will." We stood there in silence, the wind rustling through the new corn stalks. When she finally turned to leave, she paused at the edge of the driveway. "You know," she said softly, "I wasn't wrong about one thing. Order keeps things alive. But control kills them." "Yeah," I said. "But you had to bury a lot to learn that." She smiled faintly. "So did you." And then she was gone. No dramatic exit, no final threat. Just a quiet departure into the setting sun, leaving tire tracks in the dust and a strange sense of closure behind. That evening, I sat by the coop, listening to the soft clucking and the hum of sprinklers. The land was calm again. Balanced. My farm wasn't just a garden anymore, it was a story written in soil. A reminder that boundaries, whether fences or laws or egos, only hold meaning when they're respected from both sides. Later, I dug up the spot where I'd buried her first letter, the one that started everything. The paper had decomposed completely, absorbed into the earth. I smiled at the symbolism. Cheryl's war had ended exactly where it began, in the ground she tried to own. As the stars came out, I thought of how strange it was that peace can grow from conflict, how sometimes you have to fight for freedom just to learn how to live simply again. And I realized that for all her madness, Cheryl had given me something I'd never have sought on my own, a purpose bigger than revenge. Now, whenever people ask how I beat the HOA, I just tell them the truth. I didn't. I outlasted it. The land remembers what's real. Everything else just fades like chalk in the rain.